Well, hello, it's Danielle Smith, president of Alberta Enterprise Group, back for another AEG podcast. Very excited to be talking about this week. When I was in politics 100 years ago, I remember being introduced to the idea of economic corridors by James Cumming, who at the time was president of the Edmonton Chamber of Commerce. And then, of course, in the last federal election that Andrew Scheer ran, he made national economic corridors part of his platform. And it turns out this idea of economic corridors keeps on coming back every 10 years or so. We're going to trace the history and also talk about, well, maybe now is the time to really get moving on it. So I've got two excellent guests today on strategies for building economic corridors in Canada for economic growth, and also importantly, for First Nations reconciliation. I am joined now by Jerry Demchuk. He is the CEO of C2C Unity Corridor Foundation. We'll be joined very shortly as well by Chris Sankey, who's also a director on C2C2C. I hope I'm saying this right. But let's get started with a bit of the background from Jerry about where this concept came from, and then we'll get into some of the solutions that it might offer. Jerry, thanks so much for being with me today.
It's great to be here, Danielle. Happy to get engaged in this conversation.
When we were talking offline, I just love the idea. Everybody thinks, oh, I had that idea. I didn't come around to it until the 2000s. But you gave me a really great history lesson about where this notion of economic corridors came from in the first place. And I think we should start there so people understand just how long it's been around. And then we can see whether there might be enough impetus behind it now to actually get it moving. But you told me about the 1960s when this concept first came up. So give us a bit of a history lesson.
Sure. And I'll even step farther back from that. I mean, everybody recognizes that the fact that, Canada is a big country, and it's a country that was really formed on a national vision. If you look at the Trans-Canada Highway, if you look at the national railways, I mean, those were nation building projects. Back in the late 60s, a gentleman named Richard Romer had the idea that we needed to continue with that kind of national vision and start to build, newer type corridors to enable us to build infrastructure to support all the economic activities that we had. So that was a concept that he raised. He was an employee of the federal government at the time. It got a reasonable amount of traction. And like you said before, about every 10 years or even less than that, it seems to raise its head again. And there seems to be a lot of conversation around it. But it never really seems to go anywhere. So, this is kind of the present day iteration. We're no longer talking about a one corridor that spans northern Canada or even just across Canada. I think everybody can appreciate the fact that those types of projects are extremely difficult to get across the finish line these days. Really, what we're talking about is championing or developing a corridor framework that provides the opportunity for smaller versions of that to link the different economic activities or opportunities that we have in Canada together to maybe eventually form one corridor network that enables us to get to market, enables us to drive interprovincial trade and that sort of thing.
I love the concept. And so we'll talk about your new take on it in just a minute, but I want to add Chris Sankey to our stream now as well. He's a director on the C2C2C Unity Foundation. Chris, thanks so much for being with us today.
Thanks for having me.
I understand you might be a little bit limited for time today, so I want to make sure that we have a chance to talk with you. But first, I want to understand the First Nations perspective on this, because I think that there has been a lot of opposition among First Nations leadership when it comes to developing infrastructure for economic purposes. But I have a sense that there's a really strong partnership that we can have with First Nations if we start framing this issue differently about bringing services, especially to some of the rural and remote communities. So I'm kind of excited to see why you're involved in this Unity Foundation. And I just want to understand a little bit about your background and how you came to it.
Yeah, thanks. Absolutely. Well, I would say about a little over a year ago, both Jerry and a fellow by the name of Bob Steele reached out to me, and they talked about a corridor. And for many years, there's been several proposals on the table. But all of them were called energy corridors or utility corridors. And for Indigenous people along this corridor, so many of them just assumed immediately that a major project was going to be proposed or that was ready on the books to be built. And so when they first approached me on this, the first thing that stood out to me about it was the fact that they said unity. And for Indigenous people, Indigenous communities, it's about unity and it's about community. And so when they talked about the concept to me, we had several discussions before I came on board. I liked it because it was about bringing communities together in the beginning, not in the middle, not in the end, but with us together to build this infrastructure for a corridor for goods and services, oil, gas, hydrogen, whatever that may be. Prince Rupert's going to be the future of the low carbon port, and everything is headed west. And so never before in history that Indigenous people have the first time could be owners in these major developments, and which is huge. It could be transformational. It doesn't have to be just about energy. It's about goods and services, getting access to tidewater and get to new market.
You are so right about that. Tell us a little bit about the nation that where your heritage is.
Well, I'm Loch Coolams. It means Island of Roses. I'm Sibshan. It was actually one of the first fur trading posts with Hudson's Bay back in the day. And so, in fact, Grand Pacific Trunk Railway originally picked at the time, which was called Port Simpson. They were originally supposed to be the area where now Prince Rupert is today, but because of its deep harbor and where it's situated, Prince Rupert came to destiny. But further, the track, to my knowledge, with hopefully my history is correct here, but the track could not go any further because there was too much muskeg as it got further over to where Hudson's Bay was currently situated, which was in our community area. So, yeah.
Let me understand a little more about the pitch that Jerry made to you, because you said he had to come back a couple of different times. Immediately, what I'm thinking is, I think this is maybe part of the flaw in our process, is that so much infrastructure is proponent led because there's a specific project they want to get through, and yet there's so much infrastructure that can be brought as a result of resource development. But if you save it as an afterthought, it's not really putting the best foot forward. So I'm wondering how the approach on a unity corridor would differ than what we've seen in the past. I almost get the sense that pipeline projects are proposed, and then it's, and after the fact, we'll build in the fiber optics, and we'll build in the electricity, and we'll build in the roads to service it. What is the difference here?
Well, together. It's a unity corridor that wants to bring communities together to great certainty for industry. So by going in and meeting with Indigenous leaders in their communities, we get to sit down and listen to them and hear what they have to say. And it's always the same response, is that, we just want to be a part of the economic engine to help build this country. And what better way to do it by bringing them together and sitting down and actually breaking bread and listening to them and hear what they have to say. And you're never going to find one community out there that says, I want to continue to manage poverty, so I think I'm going to stick right here where I'm at. You're never going to hear that. So it's, how do we bring this together? How can we start managing wealth and getting away from poverty? And I thought the Unity Core concept made complete sense to me.
Give me some idea, if you could, in that area, because Port of Prince Rupert is such a vital port. I think we have the impression that the surrounding area is already well serviced from an infrastructure point of view. Mm-hmm. What kind of things are missing among our northern communities as we think about building out a corridor that adds in some of the missing infrastructure?
Well, electrical grids are huge, right? So electrical, I know CNREL as well has been doubling the tracks. They're called sides. I believe in the last couple of years, they were scheduled to put in about 15 sides so they could get into the Port of Prince Rupert. Initially, people thought they were going to double the track. Well, that's not the case, and nor can they. They would have to do a significant amount of major dirt movement in order for that to happen. But even that, I don't think there's enough room. So what CNREL did was that they built in 15 new sides, they're called, so they could make way for more product coming and going. So for example, there's an area on Highway 16 where they were supposed to do an overpass, and it's about 20 minutes outside Terrace. That project got put on hold, and what they were going to do, CNREL in the province, is they were going to build an overpass so traffic could keep coming and going. Right now, when the train comes, unfortunately, it stops all of Highway 16 when it passes. So initially, it was about a $35 to $40 million project, and it was to help keep traffic moving, coming and going to the Port of Prince Rupert. And you got to remember, we have coal here, we have grain. We have Volpac coming in that they want to move everything liquid. The port expansion is now currently going for the next round. It's just there's a lot going on here right now in terms of infrastructure development, and right now is the time to really pay attention.
Talk to me a bit about broadband as well, because it increasingly, I don't know how any of us did anything prior to cell phones. I don't think I got my first cell phone till 2004, but everything is on my device now. And and look, we're having this conversation with you as well, because we're able to have a clear broadband connection. But is there, give me some sense of how deficient we have in our northern communities, and how important that is to bring broadband out. Because once you have broadband, you really are connected to the world. You can do any kind of work from home, as we've discovered over the last 18 months, as long as you've got that good connection.
Yeah, I mean, it's safety, right? I mean, it's no secret that unfortunately Highway 16 between here and Prince George is known as the Highway of Tears. There's been unfortunately a lot of murdered and missing women, Indigenous women, along the highway. I know the province has put a transportation system in where it's free to take a bus to and from to Prince George. But I know in the past, a lot of the concerns were, okay, where do we help bring these individuals once we get to their destination, right? So there's a lot of that talk. And then I know the province is now wanting to put in fiber optic along the highway so we could get full access. Because right now, there's only a certain part of the highway where you could actually get cell phone service. You actually got to pull over and take the call. Other than that, there's not a lot. So you completely lose all cell phone service. And then from Terrace to Hazelton, it's the same thing. You got zero cell phone coverage. Your phone literally goes blank as soon as you got no service whatsoever. So I think those are really key infrastructure developments that I believe that are taking place. I know the feds had announced, I think, a $2.5 billion initiative for fiber optic across the country, and there's more coming. So it's going to be exciting. It's an exciting time.
Give some advice to our listeners, especially those in the energy sector, about what it is that they do wrong when they approach First Nations communities with collaboration. And I get the sense we're getting better and better at it, but obviously our energy industry is still has significant pushback and significant trouble. What is the key? What is it they're missing in the relationship?
Well, look, it's no secret, and I keep saying that Indigenous communities are going nowhere in terms of they're not going to move. Their families are here for generations, for since time immemorial. We're not going anywhere. And one of the things I find that has unfortunately not worked out for industry is that they come and go when things don't go the way that they hope they've gone. For example, Enbridge. That was a prime example. Unfortunately, there was a lot of late engagement that was taking place, but at the end of it all, I think Indigenous communities felt they were not ready for infrastructure projects such as that because there was not enough relationship building. But that being said, there was a lot of, as well as NGO narratives that were out there that were deeming Enbridge to be the big bag boogeyman. And unfortunately, there are a lot of people bought that. And so that didn't go anywhere. And for 15 years, industry thought that common sense would prevail, but the narrative that was out there kept our people in fear that a disaster was going to happen should or if that project had gone through. And the conversation was always about it's not if, it's when. So when you got that ingrained in your head for 15 years, it was really tough to change the minds of Indigenous people. That being said, where I find industry in the past has I fell short was that instead of sticking it out, instead of developing that relationship for the long term, where they set up capacity building initiatives, we're developing relationships, giving back to the community, and sticking to the relationship model about Indigenous-led opportunities, not just with the energy corridor, not just with doing engineering, not just with doing research studies and data collection. This is about really developing a long-term strategy in a relationship with Indigenous communities. When you leave, what ends up happening is that the communities then get their backs up against the wall. Well, you said you wanted to develop a relationship. So for Indigenous communities, they're looking 7 generations down the road. They're not just looking for 15 years. They're not just looking for 5 years. They're not just looking for 10 years. They're looking for every day for the next 7 generations. So if you could develop that relationship coming in and building the trust and relationship with First Nations, making them or having them lead the discussion, building confidence, building security, building the ability to trust their decision-making process, that's where the relationship is going to lead. And you're going to be in a way better spot than you were if you're just coming and going. So for decades, industry would always look to the east. If something's happening in the east, they'll go to the east. If something's happening in the west, they'll go to the west. If something's happening in the south, they'll go to the south. And so, but what I find they fall short of is if they would just stick to the area that they want to develop and develop those long-term relationships, I think by now we would have had an energy project built to the size that they wanted decades ago, about a decade or more ago. But that being said, take a look at LNG Canada, right? That's a prime example of what could happen. That took 15, 16 years.
That's such great insight. Let me bring Jerry in, because I think, Jerry, you must have an idea of how you wanted to approach this project. And I'm wondering, again, I'll ask it from your perspective as the proponent, how did you approach the nations differently that has allowed you to get a partnership going with Chris? What would be your insights on that?
So that, interesting question, Danielle. One of the things that Chris and I have talked to at length, and one of the things that he's really made me aware of is the value of actually going and building those relationships before you actually have a project that you want to put in front of someone. So one of the foundations of kind of the effort or the vision that we have at C2C2C is to start having those conversations early, which has driven the relationship with Chris to say, okay, you know what, we don't actually have a project that we're talking about just yet. We want to start to build that relationship with you guys so that we can have some of the conversations about what's important for you guys in the communities, and what's not important for you before there's actually a project to be talked about. To me, that's real partnership and real collaboration, as opposed to us showing up on the door with kind of a canned project saying, okay, you know what, here's specifically what we're talking about. One of the things that Chris has also said on numerous occasions, which I think is really pertinent to this conversation, is generally what happens is projects are planned from where they initiate to where they end up, right? And you start your consultation kind of from where you initiated to where you end up. One of the things that he's advised us is potentially starting at the end point and working back towards the middle is also a valuable approach. So it's a little bit of a shift, not much of a shift, but it's a little bit of a shift to the traditional way that companies have approached projects. But remember, with C2C2C, we're not a proponent of any one specific project. We're a proponent of developing the framework to enable a lot of different projects. So, if I can use one analogy that we use on many occasions, we're looking to develop the runway so that corporations can come and land their planes on it.
It makes perfect sense. Let me again get Chris back in here so I can understand a little more. If we're taking Port au Prince Rupert as kind of the terminal point and then working backwards, if this relationship works, give me an idea of what you see 20 years from now or 40 years from now, since you're thinking of this intergenerationally. What can happen in this area? What do you hope happens?
Oh man, it'd be a massive transformation for all of our communities to actually have equity, to have a seat and a say at the table, to dictate how they want their communities to thrive and grow. For so many years, Indigenous people have wanted to feel a part of Canada and not apart from Canada. And now, never before in the history of Canada have I ever seen such a push for Indigenous-led opportunities. And take a look at the Elizabeth government. I mean, they're proposing a $55 billion LNG project. But what I do tell people when it comes to these big projects is we've been down that road multiple times, that don't get too excited just yet until you hear the words FID, Final Investment Decision. These things take a long time. But one of the things that I believe now that I work within industry and I work with leaders, I work with some amazing people, both from industry, government, and Indigenous. Industry cannot afford to not invest into capacity building initiatives. As I mentioned earlier, for many years, what industry would do, they would come to the table and they would do an investigative study. They do data collection engineering, which is a must. It's a required if you're going to look at a potential project. But what I see the shift happening in Canada now, it's about, okay, where else can we invest our money to build capacity within our Indigenous communities? Okay, we could look at finance, we could look at economic development, we could look at administration, health, education, all those things that are going to build a relationship, and as well as from emergency response and marine safety. We're a coastal community, and a lot of our communities, the only way to get home is either by plane or by boat. And so it's a different game out here. And the other thing that industry and even some of the Indigenous communities that come out this way, in Alberta, there's a ton of treaty. They're all treaty. Mm-hmm. In BC, there's only a couple of communities that are treaty. So it's a whole different ballgame now when you come out to British Columbia. But like I said, we're stronger together when both provinces are working. You know, when the Western provinces are all working together, it benefits all Canadians as we move our product to Tidewater. And this is the time to do it. I mean, if you take a look what's happening, like I said, if you could sit down and just listen to the Indigenous leaders and hear them out, you're going to find that they're not against development. What they want is foundation so that they can look at potential projects in the future. But when there's no foundation, when they don't feel competitive in their own backyard, when they don't feel that they're a part of any sort of process, you're going to get a ton of pushback. And that is exactly what happened in the past.
Talk to me a bit, if you would, about resource development, because I had a conversation with Tom Flanagan, who's recently done an analysis for the Fraser Institute, really asserting that if we want to make sure that our First Nations communities, especially the ones that are rural and remote and small population, if we want to make sure they've got something more than an ice road, for instance, in winter, because some communities, as you mentioned, boat or fly in, or you can only drive the road when it's frozen over. If we want to make sure that all the infrastructure that is needed, including the electricity and the rail line and goods transportation, if we want to make sure that happens, his contention is that is likely to be industry-led. It's the forestry companies that would see an opportunity, the mining companies that would see an opportunity, the oil and gas companies that would see an opportunity. And so it makes sense that you would have a project in order to build that out. But now I'm sort of like trying to flip it on its head and figure this out. So what you're suggesting is you identify a community that might need that infrastructure, and then you work on building the infrastructure and then see what the opportunities are around for forestry or mining or other types of industry. Am I kind of getting the right, am I reversing it correctly? Am I thinking about this the right way?
You're close. So look, at the end of the day, it's tough to build a project it's tough to build the infrastructure with other major project that could be attached to it. But that being said, there's major infrastructure development going on right now. If you take a look what's going on, for example, one of the communities, the coastal communities, received a $43 million grant to develop a logistics hub. And that's to look at import-export for warehousing, and as well as there'll be a ton of land development, real estate development with our communities in general. If you've looked online, there's a recent study that came out around available lands in Canada, and there's not enough lands to develop more condominiums or houses right now, but the only available lands that are available are on Indigenous lands. So this could be another opportunity for real estate developers or development for our communities, because some of our communities, like mine, for example, we're right on the coast. I mean, if you ever take a trip out here, I mean, it is unbelievably beautiful. You're literally on the Pacific Ocean, and it's all undeveloped, and opportunity that could be there. I want to give you an example of what comes with development. And what a lot of people didn't realize what we lost out on when PNW went. Granted, Pacific Northwest LNG wasn't a contentious issue. The Skeena River is right there. There was an estuary. So I understood both sides of the coin. It was extremely polarizing at the time. And it wasn't so much that our people were against development. They didn't like the site. And there was a lot of data and scientific information going back and forth, and there was a lot of disagreements. Now, that being said, when PNW canceled, when I try to explain to our people, and just not just our people, but friends and just strangers in general, when they canceled, what people didn't realize, what we also lost, was that I believe China, I shouldn't say I believe, what I understood is China was looking to set up one of the largest car manufacturing plants in Prince Rupert.
Huh.
So we not only lost the opportunity of the LNG project, we lost another opportunity if or should that project could have went. But those are just examples of what could happen when industry starts to come into the area. And look, at the end of the day, nobody wants to build a project and impact or kill the environment. I've never met a person in this country that wants to destroy the environment on behalf of industry development. It's just I've never heard any conversation like that. And I think now what's happening is that Canadians are more in favor of Indigenous-led projects in Canada today. So
I will reinforce that. Like it's almost like every major project that I hear, it's led with, and here's our Indigenous partner. And I think that's amazing. I think there's so much willingness and desire to collaborate. Now, here's the question. Another question I'd have for you, though, is how should we deal with the environmental movement, which is the don't develop anything anywhere, anytime. And I think they try to find Indigenous partners to push that message forward. Your First Nations communities and leadership must feel like you're in a tug of war, really. And I wonder if there's some way that we can get around to all agreeing, yes, the environment is important, reconciliation is important, but economic health and job opportunity is important too. Do you have some advice on how to make that message stick with the environmental community?
I do. Look, I get the fact that people are worried about the air quality, the water quality, the soil quality. I get all of that. And that's why we have experts in the field to make sure we mitigate that risk. No matter what you do, whether you're building a house, a shed, or a multi-billion-dollar project, there's always some sort of environmental impact. But the way the Indigenous communities are eventually going to be handling that is that the Indigenous communities themselves are going to say, you know what, we thank you for your opportunity to protect the environment, but we've been here for 10,000 plus years. I think we know how to protect the environment. And it's the Indigenous leaders themselves that are going to be the ones that are going to be letting the environmentalists know that, look, it's time to move on. Canada and the world got your message. But we've been doing this for 10,000 plus years. I think we know what we're doing. We're still here, and we're going to help grow this country to the way we want to see it grow with our culture and our language. We have a beautiful culture and language we could offer Canada. We have knowledge that we could offer with the modern science today. And you couple those two, it could make for an amazing opportunity for all Canadians. And not just Indigenous communities.
Oh, Chris, you've given me goosebumps. I just love the vision that you've got there. And I know you're pressed for time, and you've been so generous at giving this much time to us. So I want to thank you for your thoughts, and thank you for being involved in this Unity Corridor to get the message out. I sure appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem. Look, I'm a coastal boy that worked up in the Fort McMurray area. When people ask me how the heck do I know about energy, I'm still learning, but I learned quite a bit from a lot of smart individuals in the oil sands in the energy sector itself. And at the end of the day, we won't have fishing or forestry or construction or tech without the energy sector. And it's just not possible. I know there's a transition going on, but let's be smart about it. Let's have common sense about this, because that's how we're going to move forward together. But when we start polarizing the issue, that's where nothing moves. But together with Indigenous communities, we can make amazing things happen. And as I always say, together we're stronger.
You are absolutely right. Chris Sankey, thank you so much for your time today.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thanks for coming on, Chris.
All right. So that was Chris Sankey, who's a director with the C2C2C corridor. Holy cow. Did you ever find an incredible advocate there? Now, I kind of want to know a little bit more about how you built that relationship, because you've done something that is very hard for a lot of industry proponents to do. You're doing it without having a project that you're pushing. But give me an idea of how we can replicate this kind of success in some of the other corridors that we're going to be talking about.
Yeah, you know what, Danielle, it's an interesting opportunity that we came across. We were referred to Chris by some gentlemen that we knew as being a guy who was really passionate about Indigenous collaboration. We had a number of discussions with him. We talked at length about what our vision was at C2C2C, and he talked about his vision in terms of what he thought collaboration could look like. And that really, was just through that. Part of it was through not having a specific project, but talking at a higher level about concepts and how the opportunities to work together would look like. And I think that's what intrigued him the most about what we were talking about at C2C2C. And, interestingly enough, one of the things that we've done a lot of is anytime we have the opportunity to talk to someone, obviously, we do our work in terms of understanding people's backgrounds and stuff like that. Chris did the same thing with us. He actually, when we started chatting with him, he took the concepts that we were talking about, and he started chatting with some of the Indigenous leaders that he knows just to see if there was traction. And it's interesting. One of the things that we've been finding is it's rare. To kind of echo what Chris says, it's rare that we come across someone who says this isn't a good idea. Lots of people understand the significant challenge that we're kind of facing here, but everybody seems to understand the value proposition behind an idea like this, and very much the approach that we're taking resonates with just about everybody we're talking with. So although we had a lot of discussions around that, it didn't take a long time to get to the point where we found we had a ton of common ground, and there was a real opportunity to work to make something kind of special happen.
Now, let's talk a bit about, as he was talking, I was thinking, well, this is what the federal government should be doing. It should be, because it's the federal government that can operate across jurisdictions. It's the MPs whose job it is to go out and talk to constituents. I know that some of the MPs were your starting point, and I'm wondering what some of the limitations are in having this be government-led as opposed to being nonprofit-led or industry-led.
So you referred to some of the conversations that I've had both with C2C2C and in past lives with people on the political side, whether they be MPs or bureaucrats or whatever. One of the interesting things that comes out of a lot of those conversations, and I'm sure you've heard this before, and this kind of goes back a little bit to some of the trouble we've had in Western Canada with respect to environmental groups having the upper hand or really starting to control the narrative around project development, which has caused everybody a lot of headache, obviously. One of the interesting things one of the interesting pieces of feedback that I continually got from anybody on the political side that I talk to is they're extremely supportive of whether it be the energy sector or what we're talking about at C2C2C, but they can't do it alone. So they always kind of throw it back at you saying, hey, for every step you want us to take to drive an initiative forward, we need to see the same level of effort from, whether it be individuals, whether it be a collaborative approach with Indigenous communities, whether it be from industry itself. They need to see the same approach or the same level of effort going in before they're really going to start to kind of step out on that limb and really push hard. So that's resonated with me for quite some time. And it's still true today. I was actually talking with Andrew Scheer here last week, and he brought up that same comment, and he said, listen, we as politicians, we can only do so much. It's a lot easier for us to support a really great idea or concept when it's brought to us by, whether it be an industry group, a collaborative group between industry and First Nations, or some other format. It's easier for them to support and drive an idea forward when there's the equal amount of forward push from the public or industry, like I said. And that's really where things have stalled. I mean, a lot of times, and even in my past life, we've gone to Ottawa and we've made the case that there's been significant impacts to competitiveness because we don't have access to tidewater, and all of those arguments you've heard before. And most times it kind of gets thrown back at us and saying, well, you're just coming here and making this case, and then you kind of leave it alone and don't do anything. What politicians and what bureaucrats are looking for is that same level of intensity or the same level of passion to try and push these ideas forward that people or industry are expecting of them. So that's a recognition that we have.
I love the way you've put that, because it's really flipping this whole concept on the head, because I think I've kind of at first blush expected that some prime minister would take the initiative and push this through. So you really drive it by having leadership from the top. And then barring that, it's okay, well, the only one who wants to really build these kind of corridors right now is a pipeline company. So let's get the pipeline through, and then we can backfill with all the other infrastructure that we need. And you've already put a few things on the table that show how differently you're doing it. I'm almost thinking about it like we've got, for instance, in Calgary, they're trying to build out another big piece of infrastructure, our LRT system, with a brand new line.
Right.
And the notion is,
Right.
let's find a way to connect it into what we already have. And so I'm wondering if that's kind of the concept that you have. If you're talking about Port of Prince Rupert being a major future port, where is the corridor that you're talking about connecting it to? You've already said, let's not be too grandiose in our aspirations, because if you go right out of the gate saying, let's make something national, now all of a sudden it becomes difficult to do that because you've got so many interests that you're trying to bring together. But if we look at this in just different chunks, let's deal with this first chunk in the West Coast. If you're going to build a proper corridor that supports First Nations, but also opens up the economic development opportunity, how would you do that differently from the way we've done this before?
So I think right out of the gate, there's a couple things that I need to bring up here. First, we need to kind of take a look at what's going on globally. There's a real big push right now globally, because most countries are trying to come out, drive their economies and come out of some of the economic stagnation that the pandemic caused, whether it be as well as stagnation that's come from commodity price reductions and a lot of things like that. So one of the big pushes, or one of the things globally that seems to be really accepted these days, is infrastructure development is going to drive that economic stimulus within countries. So if you look at places like Australia, if you look at places like the UK, if you look at Europe or the EU, even some of the stuff that China is doing, it's all based on a foundation of very large infrastructure development to try and, again, link together the different economic opportunities. I'll use the EU as an example. The EU, for a number of years, has had a process in place, and it's called the 10T process. And what that does is it's a process that actually has developed a system of corridors specifically built around electrical generation to try and disable the challenges when it comes to crossing country boundaries, to try and build out that electrical infrastructure across Europe. So now they have a system of corridors that really spans the EU, that gives them a more streamlined opportunity to develop that type of infrastructure. The UK went through a very similar type of infrastructure assessment that Canada is just starting to embark on right now, starting in 2015. And in 2018, they came out with a strategy that said, here's our long-term infrastructure development plan that takes us now to 2030 and potentially out to 2050. So the point of me bringing that up is there's a very big recognition or significant recognition globally that in order to get your economy really turning, you need to look obviously externally at what's going on, but you also need to look internally and understand what you need to do to drive that. And infrastructure development, really, if you think about it, builds the backbone of your country. We've seen that in Canada. We've seen that just about everywhere.
Well, you're so right. And do you think electricity is the right way to lead the effort? Because as you're talking, I'm thinking this through. I mean, without energy, without electricity, you can't develop local communities and you can't develop local hubs. And once you've got those transmission lines in place, it becomes a pretty obvious way that you'd be able to put up cell phone towers or even lay fiber optic cables. So now all of a sudden you've got broadband along that. But even more importantly, when you're talking about electricity, you're talking about linking in hydro resources in British Columbia, Manitoba, and Quebec, which also helps to talk to our neighbors who have sometimes been hostile to our energy interests from a position that they can agree on. And so I like the concept. Now, here's the problem. Every single province is responsible for regulating their own electricity grid. And so I can see some great value in starting there, but my goodness, how do you create a process so that you can get each of these electric system operators working together on that?
So I think the one thing to consider is the fact that, I mean, you alluded to this before, but I mean, this is a big endeavor, and there's lots of moving parts to it. But it really starts with a recognition from leadership, whether that be provincial leadership, whether that be national leadership, whether that be leadership within industry groups, that there is a need for infrastructure. We know that and this is well published, we know that the infrastructure deficit in Canada right now is anywhere from 120 billion to 270 billion, and there's even some people who are speculating that's as high as 550 billion dollars of infrastructure we need to actually just keep pace with the kind of the growth of the country. So one of the things that we're looking at, or we're championing at C2C is not necessarily to jump in right away and say, okay, you know what, there needs to be a corridor to connect power out of Quebec, or a port to Hudson's Bay, or a corridor that needs to go to Prince Rupert. One of the things that we're talking about is I guess a more staged process. And one of the things that Canada needs to do, and I think that hopefully this is something that's going to come out of the National Infrastructure Assessment process that's just kind of been kicked off, is to do a bit of an infrastructure audit. Now, this is something, that step then gives the ability for not only governments, being federal and provincial, but industry and Indigenous communities and Canadians in general to have an opportunity to be at the table and say, okay, you know what, for my specific region, here's some of the stuff that's important to us. And then from that, you can boil that down into, okay, now we've done our infrastructure audit. We can kind of have a better perspective on what needs to happen where, because, as well as I do, what a potential infrastructure corridor could look like coming out of Quebec might be drastically different that looks like in Alberta or Saskatchewan or BC. So, it's a critical part in the process to go through and do that infrastructure audit and really understand what we need. And then from there,
before we leave that point, how is that process taking place? You're giving me a bit of anxiety when you tell me about what's happening in Australia and Europe, and of course the Silk Road Initiative with China. It seems to me our politicians are so distracted by winning elections, by putting infrastructure projects into local communities. Like, all elections are fought on, we need to fix that interchange, or we need to build that LRT system, or we need to get a sports center built in that community, or a school or a hospital. And we're kind of missing the big picture about how we can't even begin the process of reconciliation or developing out our resources until we start looking at the kind of grand infrastructure projects that we used to be able to do, but nobody seems to be proposing them. So tell me, who's leading this national infrastructure assessment? Because I want to watch it to make sure that it actually is focused on the right things at the end of the day.
So Infrastructure Canada's kicked off a process that really is supposed to mirror what they did in the UK. So they were, in July there was a call for proposals. Companies or individuals or whoever wanted to could make a submission to the National Infrastructure Assessment. The way the process is supposed to work, and again, it's a little bit of a black hole still for me anyway, is the federal government is then supposed to come out with a strategy that starts to define what our longer term infrastructure plan or long range plan could look like. So one of the things that we did is C2C put a submission into that process that outlines exactly the process we're talking about today, starting with a bit of an infrastructure audit to try and understand regionally what needs to happen. So when you do that, you actually check a bunch of boxes in terms of really trying to drive the collaboration that we talked about with Chris Sankey. So you start to build those collaborative groups, when I say those groups, I mean, there's industry participation, there's government participation, there's Indigenous community participation, and regular, just Canadian participation in those kind of those little cohorts. And from that, we can start to build exactly what, a longer term strategy needs to be. I think one thing I want to note here is, and this comes back to what we talked about with respect to project development. I think in Canada, because everybody's really focused on the here and now, we've really lost the ability to have that long-term visionary approach, right? We've lost it at the government level. I'd say we've lost it all the way down to, even a personal level with all the stuff that's gone on. We need to regain that approach. We need companies to start looking out 30 and 40 years as opposed to that 5-year kind of horizon. And, I've always had this mantra where it's manage for today, but plan for tomorrow sort of thing. So you have that longer term vision. We need, provincial politicians to really not just talk about that, but to actually start exercising that view of saying, okay, we need a longer term vision for what our provinces are going to look like. And that has to somehow, align with a federal government vision of what a longer term vision for the country could be. And that's where, a long term infrastructure vision for Canada can really help to drive that process. Because if you think of, if we agree that infrastructure is really the backbone for economic development, a longer term strategy then starts to provide, and again, I'll come back to the analogy about the runway. It starts to provide the runway for a lot of different planes to land. One of the things that, and you're very familiar with this, it's been a big complaint that's come out of the West a lot is, we're driving our lack of regulatory certainty, our lack of policy and direction and a long-term vision is driving investors or potential investors out of Canada. So we need to now, refocus and start to build those processes and have those policies in place where we start to incent people to come back to Canada to invest. I mean, some of the biggest companies in Canada are spending the majority of their capital dollars or their investment dollars, offshore these days.
It's so true. I want you to erase some of my cynicism here. It may be hard to do because I've been in the public sphere for a long time, but here's my cynicism. This week, Natural Resources Minister Seamus O'Regan launched a consultation called the Just Transition. And there seems to be this notion that in the future, the only jobs that are going to be available are installing solar panels and wind turbines, and people in the energy sectors and traditional sectors better just transition and retrain themselves to be solar panel installers. And it kind of frustrates me because I know that our energy sector, and I loved hearing Chris Sankey say that as well, our energy sector is going to be absolutely critical to a transformation of our economy. That natural gas, we already know, helps to displace higher emitting fuels like coal and can reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Natural gas is going to form the basis for the hydrogen economy, which can fuel a lot of our transportation infrastructure, whether it's marine vessels or even trains. CP is looking at hydrogen trains, as well as our transportation network of on-road vehicles. And carbon capture, storage, and utilization. I've been talking to environmentalists who are very concerned about the level of greenhouse gas emissions that are happening globally. They think carbon capture, utilization, and storage is the only way that we're going to be able to get to net zero. And yet there's this huge campaign that has been launched by environmental groups that I think have an undue influence on our current government and administration to try to prevent carbon capture, storage, and utilization from being even considered as part of the mix. So on the one hand, yes, I get it. We're doing an infrastructure assessment, but at the end of it, is all it going to be is how many windmills and solar panels we need to build across the country? Or is it going to be real? Is it going to be talking about the real challenges that we face in being able to get our resources to market? I don't really feel like the government's committed to that long-term vision. And that's why I said, make me less cynical if you can.
So it's good. So I'm not sure I'm going to be able to do that. I mean, I have high hopes. I have high hopes that this infrastructure assessment process has some real legs to it. But it's just kicked off, so I wouldn't say I have enough information to really say that. To your other point, I mean, obviously, I spent the majority of my career working in the energy sector, so I've got a very soft spot for the energy sector. But I also understand the relationship that the energy sector has to renewable energy and all the different opportunities. So I don't think, at least the way that I look at it, there's not one simple solution to this. This is one piece of a recipe of solutions, right? So when you talk about carbon capture, that's one piece of the puzzle. And yeah, you know what? There's some real wins to be made from carbon capture and storage, no question. When you talk about hydrogen, to me, the jury's still out on hydrogen because of the economics of it. But one of the things that I would say is, what we're talking about at C2C2C and trying to build out infrastructure. If you really are bullish on the hydrogen market going forward, you need that infrastructure to support that. So there's a real close link there. I'm a real proponent of the fact that I think that the that the energy sector really, because it's such a dominant part of the economy in Canada. And when I talk about the energy sector, I talk about kind of all the extractive sectors. So, that includes mining, that includes oil and gas, all those different opportunities I kind of lump together as being energy as a whole. I think it's that part of part of our whole economic sphere that really drives our ability to capitalize on, the whole renewable sector. So it's not just one thing, and I wouldn't just point at one thing. I think all those things fit together as part of the recipe. And I think what we're talking about in terms of enabling infrastructure development to link all those different economic opportunities is something that we can really capitalize on and really drive economic development going forward. As Canada continues to grow. If you think of all the economic opportunities, whether it be in mining, oil and gas is pretty well developed and people know where that is, but there's a lot of mining opportunities in Canada that are landlocked right now. There's no infrastructure to support them. Would their economic prospects look different if all of a sudden there was potential infrastructure to support them, meaning, roads, power, access to ports? So it's not only something that really helps to support Indigenous communities and connect some of those northern communities into Canada, it also really gives us the opportunity to expand our economic stuff that drives our economic engine.
Talk to me a bit about yeah. Oh, did we lose Jerry?
No, sorry. I just wanted to say that when it comes to the federal government, again, what we're proposing at C2C, we see as something that really strengthens the federal government's position in terms of how it wants to deal with, not only existing energy development, but renewable energy development. Really kind of all the boxes around ESG. And I know you've heard that term and stuff like that. We start to think of it at C2C as not only ESG, we add another E to that, and I think that's been kicked around a bunch of times. We think it's economic, environment, social, and governance. And we think the corridor concept that we're proposing really helps the federal government to check all of those boxes.
So let me talk to you a bit about what Chris Sankey said about how in his community they're thinking generationally, like 7 generations. So I guess that's quite a different way of looking at the issue. I've met one business owner in Alberta who has a 100-year plan for his business, which I find just amazing that we've got business leaders thinking in that way. If we were thinking similarly, where do we want Canada to be 100 years from now? What are the how would we make different decisions? Because as we've been talking all the way along, I've been thinking about how other provinces or other jurisdictions do things differently. For instance, Mexico, when it was building itself out, they identified a new area every year that they wanted to develop into a tourist destination. It's part of the reason why in Canada we have so many wonderful sun destinations now to go to. But I don't know that I've ever really heard the government talking about, oh, here's a new port that we need to develop, or here's a new rail line that we need to get built, or how are we going to open up the Ring of Fire in Ontario? It just seems like that isn't even really under consideration, unless there's somebody squirreling away in a department behind the scenes with the 100-year vision. I just don't even know if we're accustomed to thinking that way. But I want to ask you to walk us through the exercise. If we were thinking, what is Canada going to be in 100 years? What would be the things we'd be considering?
I think, I agree with you that I'm not sure that at any level of government they're thinking that far out. I mean, we both know, or I think everybody realizes that government has kind of one vision, and in Canada it's a 4-year vision. So you try and accomplish what you can in that 4-year. But if you think about the bureaucratic level, I think there are a number of people at the bureaucratic level who are starting to think about what does our longer term vision need to look like? Because, I mean, we hear the predictions every day, and you can read them every day in the newspaper about the fact that, deficits continue to grow. We're going to struggle coming out of the pandemic. What's our longer term vision? How do we get the economy back on track? And there's not a lot of answers coming that are coming out on that. But I do think that there's lots of work behind the scenes that's going on to support this kind of thinking. And I think a lot of that is being driven by the recognition that other countries around the world are doing that. So we need to start doing that. Again, I'll give you another example. I mean, the U.S. yesterday just agreed to, some numbers around their very large infrastructure stimulus bill. And one of the things that's built within that bill is a recognition that they need to streamline, their processes between federal and state so that they can enable infrastructure to actually happen, as opposed to being kind of stonewalled. So that recognition is being driven in a lot of different places around the world. And that's something that, that's part of what we need to recognize in Canada. But even coming to terms with what a long-term infrastructure plan, what a long-term infrastructure development plan can look like, I think is the first step. And I think the government's starting to take steps in the right direction. But it's still so early in the process. It's hard to say whether it's going to be a long-term process or whether this is, something to kind of garner a lot of excitement around an election.
It's always my frame of reference always resorts back to proponent-led type of projects. If I look at what China's doing with Silk Road, it seems to me that they're saying we are going to need rare earth metals and minerals. And so therefore we are going to support development in various places in Africa and around the world to build ports and roads and tankers and rail lines so that we can make sure that we have the resources that we need to continue to fuel our economy. I mean, that in itself is a 100-year vision. And that is something we could develop too, because we do have a lot of that same resource wealth. So if we started there and tried to say that we needed to open up some of that mining opportunity, give me some idea of the kind of corridors and the kind of infrastructure we need to develop. I know we talked about this offline, and you don't want to put yourself out there as proposing a particular corridor or a particular line, but give us some idea of, there's got to be some good work that's already been done on major areas that need a serious infrastructure investment of the time that of this type that we're talking about. We've already talked about Port of Prince Rupert. You mentioned Churchill. Talk to me a bit about that. What would that look like? There's
a numerous proposals for and Indigenous-led proposals actually for rail opportunities out to Churchill. The Port of Churchill is looking to expand. It's a deep water port in Hudson's Bay. They are very, very bullish on opportunities to run that port there. There's also the Ring of Fire in Northern Ontario. I mean, that's an area where we probably have, and numbers that have been quoted to me have been in the high billions, kind of almost to $1 trillion worth of value that's landlocked there. So there is some road infrastructure into the Ring of Fire, but there's not the rail infrastructure. There's some proposals around that. But again, like anything that we've come up against lately, individual proponents or individual projects are really having a tough go in Canada these days. So, an overarching framework that would help them out would be very valuable. But again, I come back to, there's power infrastructure that needs to be put in place there. There's additional road infrastructure. There's rail infrastructure. And then there's also an opportunity for, potentially for a port on the east side of Hudson's Bay as well, which gives us a little bit of a shorter access to that. And then there's still, base metal opportunities in a bunch of the provinces, and there's base metal opportunities in the territories that right now sit 100% landlocked just because there is no access at all, no services or anything like that. So, to kind of mirror what other countries are doing, and your specific example about China, we need to start thinking long term about security of supply or security of economic opportunities going forward, and start to build the infrastructure to enable those opportunities to take place.
So talk to me a bit more about Ring of Fire. I told you I was going to put you on the spot on this one because it's hard to even imagine that we've got $1 trillion worth of untapped wealth and no real push on to try to develop the infrastructure out there to make it happen. So I think you told me that Timmins is kind of the entry point into that
That's
area.
right.
Now, it's a good example of whose job is it? We've kind of left it to mining companies to go through these ridiculously long regulatory approval processes, at the end of which it's almost always a no. And so, how do you develop a collaborative approach between the federal government and the Ontario government? Let's depersonalize it from Alberta for a minute, because we feel like
Right.
that Bill C-69 that came through, we've referred to it as the No More Pipelines bill, but I think the mining industry has realized it might be the No More Mines bill as well, which
That's
is
right.
kind of bananas. If we're going to move to even if we are going to move to more electric vehicles, those need to have the rare earth base metals to be able to support the battery technology. And so, if we're not prepared to do our own mining to get the resources we need for that battery technology, then how serious are we about doing this transition in the first place? So, that's how I'm looking at it. It seems like every time we put something forward as a solution, there's a group or a counter movement to try to make sure nothing gets done. And I'm grateful for you to be trying a different approach. I'm just wondering how breakthrough happens. Maybe you can walk us through that.
So from our view, and I guess my thinking on that is, it's not one specific group or one specific opportunity that drives the breakthrough. I mean, this is a collaborative effort. This is going to be a collaborative effort right through the entire process. So there has to be the vision from the federal government. There has to be the recognition from the federal government that infrastructure development is important, and this is something that they recognize as part of the longer term vision for Canada. So they support that. There has to be the same recognition from the provinces that infrastructure build out is important for a lot of different reasons. We talk about breaking down interprovincial trade barriers. We talk about access to tidewater. We talk about just driving economic development in general. So that recognition has to come from the provinces. Industry needs to be supportive of that process within government, as opposed to coming and complaining and trying to kind of bang against the wall. And I know that's frustrating. And I know that 9 times out of 10, you feel like you're talking to people who don't really understand what you're talking about and don't really have a sympathetic ear. So the other component of that I think is a bit of a wild card is what we talked about earlier, is Indigenous opportunities and Indigenous collaboration. I think that Indigenous communities have a real opportunity to be a real influencer in this whole process, right? I mean, Indigenous communities are located in virtually all the regions that a corridor concept would provide a lot of value. So early engagement and collaboration with those communities and a real positive endorsement does a lot to drive that forward. It's getting everybody's attention these days, and rightly so. So I think there's got to be a bit of a 4-pronged approach, and I know it's a tall order, but I mean, I guess the way that we look at it at C2C2C is if we're not able to move the bar on this, or if something isn't able to happen to drive infrastructure development, then the future doesn't look that bright. Right. And then I think that's the recognition that everybody has to have. And so, we need to work hard to not only convince politicians that this is the right thing to do, but convince them in a collaborative way. So this isn't, we've talked about it before, how there's always that East-West dynamic where, it seems to be more controversial and kind of headbanging than positive. What we're trying to do is be part of the solution and create that positive dynamic.
So you've got me thinking then, if the federal government has embarked on this process, have they received all their submissions, or is that process still open to?
No, that process closed. That process closed on July 30th.
July
so
30th.
they're now reviewing.
Oh, so it's closing. Today's July 29th, so it closes tomorrow.
No, sorry, June 30th, not July 30th.
Okay, got it. Yeah. So I guess the other part of the question is are provinces doing a parallel effort? Because that seems to be needed, that the province needs to do, and probably could do a better job of identifying local infrastructure needs that would connect into a national network. Are you seeing any efforts there?
We're hearing conversations along that line. I wouldn't say we're seeing substantial efforts. I do think that provinces did contribute to this process, and I do think that provinces are kind of standing by, saying, "Okay, how's this going to work? Where is our opportunity to really be engaged in this process?" I know that obviously we made a submission. I think there was a number of submissions. I know a number of Indigenous communities made submissions. I know a number of industrial groups or industry groups made submissions. I know a lot of individual companies made submissions. So one of the things that's going to be difficult for the federal government is to kind of try and figure out what they need to do with all that information they've gotten. Now, one of the things that I think they can do is they'll have the opportunity to kind of categorize their submissions into individual project submissions. So I think there are lots of people who are advocating for, kind of individual projects, which is valuable. But I think this is more about developing an overall process to enable infrastructure development. So I think the other category is those higher level, how can we impact, or how can we set up a process that's really going to drive this process forward?
Have you looked at any infrastructure projects of the past? Because you have to wonder, could St. Lawrence Seaway have been built today, or the Trans-Canada Pipeline, or Trans-Canada Rail Line, or the Trans-Canada Highway, or even I love the Klondike story. So I've been up to both Whitehorse as well as Skagway, Alaska, and it's shocking to think that entire gold rush took place over a couple of years, and they managed to build a rail line to facilitate having miners go up there to try to do their prospecting in a matter of months. And you think, how in the world were they able to do that then? And we can't even develop a process to develop infrastructure in a shorter period of time. I mean, I don't want to be negative about it, but there just doesn't seem to be the will to actually put the shovel in the dirt and get things done.
Well, I agree with you. I don't think anything of the scale that you mentioned there would have much of a chance to be built today. And I think that's part of the reason why, the approach that we're taking at C2C and trying to break it down into smaller opportunities, so smaller corridors that are really focused in specific areas that drive specific economic opportunities. It's still think of it as still kind of a regulatory envelope or a process or a framework that covers how you could do this just about everywhere in Canada, but you can apply it on a very localized scale, which then, it comes back to the analogy of, how do you eat the elephant, or how do you climb Mount Everest? It's one step at a time. So we're breaking it down into smaller, more manageable pieces, which I do think have an opportunity to be successful, especially if we have Indigenous support or Indigenous collaboration to go along with them, and then as long as the government's willing to really kind of approach this, with a process to try and put a plan in place so that we can be successful.
Let me deal with one other environmental aspect to see how you've thought that through, because I've been following the environmental movement for some time, probably since the mid 90s. And so there's the one avenue along greenhouse gas emissions. And I think that we've got some really good solutions for that, where the energy industry can help in that transformation. But there's sort of this other kind of approach on protected land areas and developing whole vast landscapes that are untouched, like the Y2Y initiative. And I think there's an A to A initiative as well in Ontario. I've often felt like Canada is a bit of a demonstration project for the United Nations on just how much land base can be locked up in parkland and protected land and not used. And I wonder how we bring environmentalists over to the view that you can protect landscapes, you can have the environmental things that we all care about, but you still have to have that first E that you were talking about. You still need to have economic development. The very best environmental outcomes come from jurisdictions that have the strongest economies. Because when you've got money and you've got wealthy people, they can afford to care about the environment and devote some money to it. And it seems to me like if we're talking about coalition, I'm wondering how that part of the coalition comes in, because they're extraordinarily powerful, and I don't know that we've found a way to bring and collaborate with the environmental community in a way that allows us to get anything done.
Yeah, that's a tough one to answer, because I do think there's a component of that where you'll never be able to answer that question, or you'll never actually be able to have that coalition. I mean, I guess I'm of the view that the environmental movement has a number of different components to it. There's the component of the environmental movement that is the business of the environment. And then there's the component of it that actually is, I really care about the environment and want to make sure we do things right. So I don't know that you'll ever convince the people who are in the camp of the business of the environment that any sort of development is ever good. I think we've seen that so many different times. We've seen that in BC. We've seen that in other parts of the country. I mean, that's really what's driven a lot of the opposition to all of these different projects. We're trying to focus more on that I guess that dynamic, or that cohort within that group that says, okay, you know what, we understand that economic development is one of the most important things. We're also very concerned about the environment. One of the important things about the corridor concept, and I think one of the real positive things about the corridor concept that we talk about, is having the ability to, identify corridors and then go through a process using, the Canadian regulations that we have in place, both provincial and federal, which are world class in terms of protecting the environment. I mean, I don't think anybody can argue that. To pre-assess the corridor. So in other words, understand what the environmental aspects of a corridor in a specific region could look like, understand the potential environmental impacts of any sort of development within that corridor, and then really start to talk before anything's even built there about what type of mitigation would be required for anything that was being constructed in a corridor like that. So that's one of the real positive things about, engaging with Indigenous communities early, is you can have a lot of the conversations that were really stonewalling projects before there's even projects to be discussed. And I think there's a real opportunity to develop a process that then takes a lot of those conversations off the table, or answers a lot of the questions before they actually even become questions.
Well, I love the initiative, because the way I'm thinking about it is that at the moment, everything is a no-go zone. And when you start talking about these corridors for development, you're creating go zones. You're sort of creating the pre-approval where people know if they've got a project they want to do, they're going to have a streamlined regulatory process if they build it in the areas that we're talking about once we've identified those. So let's talk a little bit about your organization and what you think organizations like Alberta Enterprise Group and others can do to lend their voice to your efforts. So first of all, tell us where people can get a copy of your submission.
Our submission, you can go to our website, www.unitycorridor.ca, or C2C2C unitycorridor.ca, sorry. That's you can get it from there. You can get it off I believe you can get it off our social media page as well, on LinkedIn. And then, if you want to reach out to us directly, you can reach out through our website as well. I think our website is probably the best place to get the information right now. I mean, we're trying to interact with a lot of different groups. If people are interested in actually having a conversation with us, then I'm happy to reciprocate. So I'm not exactly sure how to, if I put my own email address on here or.
No, we don't want to get you bombarded. Let's direct people to your website. But what can groups like Alberta Enterprise Group do to help you along? I mean, there are a lot of business groups across the country, all the chambers. We've got Business Council of Alberta. We've got all the different manufacturers associations across the country. Are we sufficiently engaged?
No, we're just starting out. I think there's lots of engagement with those groups. We'd like to interact with just about every one of those groups, talk about our concept. I mean, one of the things, in terms of the collaborative process, there's a couple things that we're really interested. We're really interested in hearing people's opinions. We want to know what people think. We want to know if there's some of the stuff that we should consider as part of our process. So any opportunity to interact with any of these groups would be very valuable for us. We talk about our approach. We'd love to hear their opinion on our approach. We talk about our funding situation. There's a lot of different opportunities to discuss things.
Well, and I know as a nonprofit myself, there's always funding challenges,
That's right.
but how are you funded?
Right now, we're private. I guess we're publicly funded right now through a bunch of different, individual and industry donors. We're always looking for more funding, so that's a part of our business model is to be able to have discussions with people who are very supportive of the idea, and if they're, willing to provide support, that's awesome.
That's terrific. So, what do you think needs to be done for it to be successful this time? We talked about how this idea of economic development and corridors has been going on for, I guess, going on 60 years now. And every so often there's a burst of enthusiasm to push it along. Are we reaching a point where it's become critical for us to do something, or is this going to get pushed along? And I'll talk to you on our podcast another 10 years from now when it gets resurrected again.
Well, I think we're to the point where this is critical, that we need to start moving forward, because, as you know as well as anybody, even if this process started to move forward and we started to build a framework that would enable corridors, infrastructure development is not something that happens overnight. Projects take time to get planned, to get constructed, to be put in operation. So, if we're looking at a 20 or 30 or 40 or 50 year plan for infrastructure development, we need to start now to start building out exactly what that's going to look like, and what is within the 20-year window, what is within the 30-year window, that sort of stuff. So I think it's critical that we move on this now. We want to also keep pace with, we want to give Canada the opportunity to grow, and all those economic opportunities, an opportunity to flourish. So now's the time to do that.
All right. And what is the time frame for when the federal consultation is going to be out? I mean, we're hearing rumblings about a fall election. I'm pretty sure this is not going to be completed in time for that, since it just had a June 30th submission deadline. So what should we be looking for there?
We originally heard that the next steps of that process were going to be sometime at the end of August, or at least, a release of what the next steps could look like would be sometime around the end of August. So we're just kind of standing by, waiting to see what's happening there. One of the things that we're doing as well is, we've initiated our government relations program to support our submission. So we're starting to meet with very specific people within the ministries in Ottawa to find out exactly what the next steps are going to be, and to try and make sure that we understand what the next steps are, but they also understand what's in our submission and how we're willing to help, or how we can help this process.
Well, I'm so glad that you got it started and that you've brought us into the loop on what's going on. We'll make sure to continue to follow your work. And thanks again for your initiative on it.
That's my pleasure. This is something that we're all very passionate about, and we think is a real opportunity to be an impactor, or to impact how Canada can grow going forward.
Right on. Totally agree. Thank you, Jerry.
Thanks, Danielle.
You got it. That is Jerry Demchuk. Yeah, we also spoke with Chris Sankey. Both of them are with the C2C2C Unity Corridor. Now, if you want to look that up, it's the letter C followed by the number 2, followed by the letter C, number 2, followed by the letter C. You get me? So C2C2C Unity Corridor Foundation. And it sounds like things are moving along faster than I would have expected. So consultation submissions ended June 30th. And he believes next steps are going to be mapped out in August. I think our next step is to figure out how our provincial government is going to be plugging into that, and see if there are some ways in which we can help to advance it. But what I love about what they're proposing is that it begins with unity, it begins with finding partners, and then the proponents of different projects step in afterwards. And that, I think, is the only way that we're going to get anything built in this country. All right, my friends, we are out of time for today. Once again, I'm Danielle Smith, president of Alberta Enterprise Group. We will be back at it again next week. Thanks for tuning in.